The eviction notice had been taped to her apartment door for 3 days before Sarah finally pulled it down. Not because she didn't see it. She saw it every time she came home from her shift at the diner, every time she carried her daughter Emma up the stairs after picking her up from the neighbor who watched her for free out of pity. She saw it in the morning when she left for work before dawn, and she saw it at night when she returned, smelling of grease and coffee and exhaustion. The notice was impossible to miss, printed on bright yellow paper with bold letters that seemed to shout even when no one was speaking. But she left it there because taking it down would mean acknowledging it was real. And she wasn't ready for that. Not yet. The apartment was small, a one-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better decades. The hallway always smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and mildew, and the stairwell light had been broken for so long that climbing the steps at night required memory more than sight. But it was home. Or it had been. The rent had been manageable once, back when she still had 2 jobs instead of 1, back when Emma's father had still been around to contribute, before he disappeared with promises that he would send money and never did. Now the rent was 3 months overdue, and the landlord had made it clear that sympathy had limits. She worked 6 days a week at the diner, pouring coffee and taking orders from people who barely looked at her. The tips were inconsistent, sometimes generous, more often sparse. On good days, she made enough to cover groceries and keep the lights on. On bad days, she chose between one or the other. Emma was 4 years old, bright and full of questions Sarah could never quite answer. Why don't we have a car like Sophie's family? Why can't I go to the dance class the other girls go to? Why do you always look so tired, Mama? Sarah answered with smiles and distractions, with promises that things would get better soon, with the kind of hope that felt more like lying the longer it went on. The morning she finally took the eviction notice down, she folded it carefully and placed it in her purse. She didn't cry. There was no time for crying. She had to be at work in an hour, and Emma needed breakfast, and the world kept moving whether she could keep up with it or not. But as she stood there in the dim hallway, staring at the rectangle of slightly cleaner paint where the notice had been taped, she felt something shift inside her. Not despair, though that was always there, humming quietly in the background. This was something sharper, a kind of clarity. She could not stay here. She could not keep doing this. Something had to change, and it had to change now. It was her coworker Linda who mentioned the auction. They were standing in the kitchen of the diner during a rare lull, the lunch rush over, the dinner crowd not yet arrived. Sarah was scraping plates into the trash, while Linda wiped down the counter. Linda was older, maybe 50, with a voice roughened by decades of cigarettes and a habit of speaking without filter. She had been complaining about her nephew, who had just bought a house at a county auction for almost nothing and was flipping it for profit. Sarah listened without much interest. She had no money to buy anything, let alone a house. But Linda kept talking, as she always did, about how the county held auctions every month for abandoned properties, places no one wanted, places the city was trying to offload just to clear the tax rolls. Warehouses, vacant lots, crumbling houses. Some of it was junk, Linda said, but sometimes there were deals. Real deals. If you were willing to take a risk. Sarah said nothing, but the word stuck in her mind. Risk. She thought about it that evening as she sat on the floor of her apartment with Emma, building a tower out of blocks they had gotten from a thrift store. She thought about it when she checked her bank account and saw the number that never seemed to grow no matter how many hours she worked. She thought about it when she lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the couple in the apartment above her argue in muffled voices that seeped through the thin walls. Risk. She had nothing left to lose. The auction was held in a gray municipal building downtown, in a room that smelled of old carpet and air conditioning set too cold. Sarah had called in sick to work, the first time she had ever done so, and brought Emma with her, settling the girl in a corner with a coloring book and crayons. The room was half full with people who looked like they knew what they were doing. Men in work boots and flannel shirts, a few older couples with calculators and binders full of notes. Sarah sat in the back and tried not to feel out of place. She had $800 in her checking account, the absolute limit she could access without overdrawing. It was every penny she had left after paying what she could toward rent, after buying food, after setting aside the small emergency fund she kept hidden in an envelope under her mattress. $800. She had no idea if it was enough to buy anything, but she had come, and now she would see. The auctioneer was a man in his 60s, with a voice like gravel and a manner that suggested he had done this 1,000 times before. He stood at a podium with a microphone and a list of properties, calling them out one by one. Vacant lots sold for hundreds. Small houses with structural damage sold for thousands. Sarah watched as people raised their hands, called out bids, and competed with the ease of experience. She did not raise her hand. She only watched and waited, her heart beating faster than it should, her palms damp. Then the auctioneer read a listing that made her sit up straighter. Industrial warehouse, derelict condition, located on the outskirts of the city near the old rail yard. Approximately 12,000 square feet. Roof partially collapsed. No utilities. No recent occupancy records. Sold as is. No guarantees. No refunds. The auctioneer's tone carried the weight of something no one wanted. He started the bidding at $500. No one moved. He lowered it to $300. Still nothing. He sighed, made a joke about giving it away for free, and was about to move on when Sarah raised her hand. The auctioneer paused, looked at her, as if confirming she was serious, then nodded. $300, he said. Going once. No one else bid. Going twice. The room was silent. Sold, he said, for $300. Sarah stood, walked to the desk, and paid in cash. The clerk handed her a receipt and a single sheet of paper with the property address and a legal description she didn't fully understand. She folded it carefully and put it in her purse, next to the eviction notice. Her hands were shaking. Emma tugged at her sleeve, asking if they could go get ice cream now. Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure she had enough money left for ice cream. They walked out of the building into the bright afternoon, and for the first time in months, Sarah felt something she couldn't name. Not quite hope, not quite fear. Something in between. The mockery began almost immediately. When she told Linda what she had done, Linda laughed so hard she had to sit down. "A warehouse," she said, still laughing. "What are you going to do with a warehouse, Sarah? You don't even have a car." The other waitresses gathered around, curious, and when they heard the story, they laughed too. Not cruelly, not exactly, but with the kind of amusement reserved for someone who had done something absurd. One of them asked if she planned to live in it. Another said it would probably cost more to tear down than it was worth. Sarah smiled and said nothing. She had learned long ago that explaining herself never changed anyone's mind. Her landlord was less amused. When she told him she needed a few more days to move out, that she had bought a property, and just needed time to figure out what to do with it, he stared at her with open disbelief. "You bought a warehouse?" he said flatly. "Oh, with what money?" "The money you owe me?" Sarah felt her face flush, but she kept her voice steady. She told him she would be out by the end of the week. He shook his head and muttered something about people making terrible decisions. As he walked away, Sarah heard him say to someone else that she was crazier than he thought. Her mother, when Sarah finally called to explain why she might need to stay with her for a few days, was even worse. "What were you thinking?" her mother said, her voice rising in pitch. "You can't even pay your rent and you bought a building? A condemned building? Sarah, this is insane. You have a daughter to think about. You can't just go around buying junk because you think it's going to solve your problems." Her mother went on for several minutes, her words a mix of disappointment and frustration, until Sarah quietly said she had to go and hung up. She sat on the edge of her bed, Emma asleep beside her, and felt the weight of every word pressing down on her chest. Maybe they were right. Maybe she had made a mistake. But it was done now, and there was no going back. The warehouse was located on the industrial edge of the city, where the streets turned to gravel and the buildings stood like tombstones against the flat horizon. Sarah borrowed Linda's car, promising to return it by the end of the day, and drove out with Emma strapped into the back seat. The neighborhood, if it could be called that, was desolate. Empty lots stretched between corrugated metal structures, most of them abandoned, their windows broken, their doors hanging open. Weeds grew thick through cracks in the pavement, and the air smelled faintly of rust and oil. The only sound was the distant hum of the highway and the occasional clang of metal from some unseen source. When she found the address, she almost kept driving. The warehouse stood at the end of a dead-end street, set back behind a chain-link fence that had long since collapsed inward. The building itself was massive, a hulking rectangle of red brick, darkened by decades of soot and weather. The roof had indeed collapsed on one side, leaving a jagged hole through which the sky was visible. Windows along the upper level were either shattered or missing entirely, and the large rolling door at the front was rusted shut, its metal surface streaked with orange and brown. Graffiti covered parts of the lower walls, crude tags and symbols that had faded into illegibility. The ground around it was littered with debris, broken glass, and chunks of concrete and scraps of metal that had blown in from who knew where. Sarah parked the car and sat for a moment, staring through the windshield. Emma asked if this was their new house. Sarah didn't answer right away. She wanted to say no. She wanted to start the car and drive back to the city and find some other solution, any other solution. But there was no other solution. She had spent $300. She had less than $500 left. This was what she had. She unbuckled her seatbelt, told Emma to stay in the car, and stepped outside. The air was colder here, or maybe it just felt that way. She walked toward the building slowly, her boots crunching on gravel and broken glass. The fence was easy to pass through, the chain link bent and torn. She approached the rolling door and tried to lift it, but it didn't budge. The rust had fused it to the ground. She walked along the side of the building, looking for another way in, and found a smaller door, its wood swollen and warped but still intact. She pushed against it with her shoulder. Once, twice, and on the third try it gave way, swinging inward with a groan that echoed into the darkness beyond. The smell hit her first. Damp and thick, a mix of mold, rotted wood, and something else she couldn't identify. She stepped inside and waited for her eyes to adjust. Light filtered in through the broken roof and the shattered windows, casting long beams that illuminated only fragments of the interior. The space was vast, far larger than it had seemed from outside. The floor was concrete, cracked in places, stained with oil and dirt. Rusted machinery sat in clusters, their purposes long forgotten. Metal shelves leaned at angles, their surfaces empty except for dust. In one corner, a stack of wooden pallets had collapsed into a heap. In another, a pile of what looked like old tires rose like a dark monument. Sarah walked deeper into the building, her footsteps echoing. Every sound seemed amplified in the emptiness. She saw the remains of an office along one wall, its windows broken, its door hanging from a single hinge. Inside were overturned desks, filing cabinets with drawers pulled open and emptied, papers scattered across the floor. She picked up one of the papers. It was an invoice from 1987, so faded she could barely read it. She dropped it and kept walking. The roof damage was worse than it had looked from outside. The collapse had created a gaping wound in the center of the building, through which rain and snow had poured for years. The floor beneath was rotted, the concrete crumbling into a shallow crater filled with stagnant water and debris. She skirted around it carefully, not trusting the ground. On the far side of the warehouse, a set of metal stairs led up to a second level, a kind of mezzanine that overlooked the main floor. She tested the first step with her weight. It held. She climbed slowly, gripping the rusted railing, until she reached the top. From here, she could see the full scope of the building. It was enormous, and it was a disaster. There was no way to repair this, no way to make it livable, no way to sell it for more than she had paid. She had bought a ruin, a monument to her own desperation and stupidity. She stood there for a long time, feeling the weight of it settle over her. Then she went back down the stairs, walked out the door, and returned to the car. Emma asked if she liked their new house. Sarah said it needed some work. Emma asked if they could go home now. Sarah started the car and drove back to the city in silence. That night, lying awake in the apartment she was about to lose, Sarah thought about the warehouse. She thought about the mockery, the disbelief, the disappointment in her mother's voice. She thought about the eviction notice and the $800 she had once had and the $500 she had left. She thought about Emma, asleep beside her, trusting her, depending on her. She thought about the choices she had made and the choices she had left. And somewhere in the exhaustion and the fear, a small, stubborn thought surfaced. She had bought the warehouse for $300. She owned it. It was hers. Maybe it was worthless. Maybe it was a mistake. But it was the only thing she owned outright in the entire world. And if there was even the smallest chance that it could be something more, she had to try. The next morning, she went back. This time she brought tools. Not much, just what she could borrow from Linda's garage. A crowbar, a flashlight, a pair of work gloves. She dropped Emma off at her mother's house, ignoring the disapproving silence that filled the room. She promised to pick her up by evening and left before her mother could start another lecture. Then she drove back to the warehouse, alone. The building looked no better in daylight. If anything, it looked worse. The graffiti seemed more aggressive, the rust more pervasive, the emptiness more absolute. But Sarah ignored all of that. She wasn't here to admire it. She was here to see if there was anything inside worth salvaging, anything she could sell, anything that might justify what she had done. She spent the first hour clearing debris near the entrance, dragging broken pallets outside, sweeping away glass with a broom she found lying in a corner. It was hard work, and by the time she stopped, her back ached and her hands were sore despite the gloves. But the space near the door was clearer now, enough that she could move more freely. She worked her way deeper into the building, methodically checking each corner, each pile of junk, each abandoned piece of machinery. She found nothing of value, just rust and rot and remnants of a place that had been forgotten long before she arrived. It was late afternoon when she reached the back wall of the warehouse. The light here was dimmer, the shadows heavier. The wall itself was lined with old metal lockers, the kind workers might have used to store their belongings. Most of them were open, their doors hanging loose or missing entirely. She checked them anyway, finding nothing but dust and the occasional scrap of paper. But one locker, near the end of the row, was closed. Not just closed, but locked. A heavy padlock hung from the handle, its surface so rusted it looked like it might crumble if touched. Sarah stared at it for a moment. It was probably nothing. Just an old locker someone had locked years ago and never bothered to open again. But the lock nagged at her. Why lock an empty locker? Why leave a lock on it at all? She took the crowbar and wedged it between the door and the frame. She pulled. The metal groaned but held. She adjusted her grip, braced her foot against the wall, and pulled harder. The lock snapped, the door swung open, and Sarah stumbled backward, catching herself against the opposite wall. Inside the locker was a small canvas bag, old and stained, tucked into the back corner. Sarah reached in and pulled it out. It was heavier than it looked. She unzipped it and looked inside. Papers, documents, a few small metal objects she didn't recognize. She carried the bag to the light near the broken roof and sat down on an overturned crate. She spread the contents out in front of her and began to look through them. The papers were old, some yellowed, some brittle at the edges. Most were invoices, bills of sale, shipping manifests. But as she read more carefully, she began to see a pattern. The warehouse had once been owned by a manufacturing company that went bankrupt in the early 1990s. The documents detailed shipments, inventory, transactions. There were references to storage units, to secure areas, to restricted access. One document, dated 1989, mentioned a vault installed in the basement level for high-value inventory. Sarah read the line again. Basement level. She looked around the warehouse. She hadn't seen any stairs going down. She hadn't even considered that there might be a basement. She stood and walked back toward the center of the building, scanning the floor more carefully now. Most of it was open concrete, but along the back wall, near where she had found the locker, the floor changed. There was a section covered by metal plates, large squares of steel bolted into the ground. She crouched beside one and ran her hand along the edge. It was flush with the floor, but not quite level. She wedged the crowbar under one corner and pried. The plate shifted just slightly. She pulled harder, and with a screech of metal, the plate lifted. Beneath it was darkness, and a set of stairs leading down. Sarah stared into the opening, her heart pounding. She had thought the warehouse was empty. She had thought there was nothing here worth finding. But now, standing at the edge of this hidden entrance, she felt the same sensation she had felt the day she raised her hand at the auction. Not quite hope, not quite fear. Something in between. She picked up the flashlight, tested it to make sure the batteries still worked, and took a breath. Then she descended into the dark. The stairs were steep and narrow, and the walls close on either side. The air grew colder as she went down, and the smell changed. Less mold, more dust, more stillness. The flashlight beam cut through the blackness, revealing concrete walls and a floor that hadn't seen light in decades. At the bottom of the stairs was a corridor, short and narrow, ending in a heavy metal door. The door was closed, and beside it, mounted on the wall, was a keypad, the kind that required a code. Sarah approached slowly, her breath shallow. The keypad was old, its buttons yellowed, its screen dark. She pressed one of the numbers. Nothing happened. The power was long dead. But the door itself, heavy and solid, was still there, and it was locked. She ran her hand along the frame, feeling for any weakness, any gap. There was none. The door was sealed tight. She stepped back, her mind racing. At a vault, a locked basement, a warehouse no one had wanted. She thought about the documents in the canvas bag, the references to high-value inventory. She thought about the people who had mocked her, who had called her foolish, who had said she had wasted her money. And she thought about the crowbar in her hand, and the $300 she had paid, and the life she was trying to build for her daughter. She raised the flashlight and examined the door more closely. There had to be a way in. There always was. And if there was something behind that door, something valuable, something that could change everything, then she was going to find it. Even if it took days, even if it took weeks. She had come this far. She wasn't stopping now. The door stood before her like a challenge. Solid, immovable, locked by mechanisms she didn't understand, and codes she didn't have. But Sarah had learned something in the years since Emma was born, since her life had become a series of obstacles placed between her and survival. She had learned that walls could be climbed, that locks could be broken, and that the only person who would save her was herself. She went back up the stairs, emerging into the fading light of the warehouse. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows through the broken roof. She checked her phone. It was almost evening. She had promised to pick Emma up, and she couldn't be late. Not again. But as she stood there, staring at the metal plates covering the basement entrance, she felt a pull she couldn't ignore. She had found something. She didn't know what yet, but she had found something. And tomorrow, she would come back. She would bring better tools. She would figure out how to open that door, and she would see what lay behind it. That night, after picking up Emma and enduring another silent meal with her mother, Sarah lay in bed and thought about the vault. She thought about the documents she had found, the references to high-value inventory, the careful installation of a secure basement. Companies didn't install vaults for nothing. They didn't lock things away unless those things mattered. And if they mattered 30 years ago, maybe they still mattered now. It was a long shot. It was probably nothing. But it was the first thread of possibility she had felt in longer than she could remember. And she was going to pull on it until it either unraveled or led somewhere real. The next day, she called in sick to work again. Linda was starting to ask questions, but Sarah deflected them with vague answers about needing to handle something important. She dropped Emma off earlier than usual and drove to the warehouse with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. This time, she brought a hammer, a chisel, and a battery-powered angle grinder she had rented from a hardware store, with money she didn't really have. She was done being careful. She was done waiting for permission. If there was a way through that door, she was going to find it. She descended the stairs again, the flashlight beam bouncing off the walls. The basement was exactly as she had left it, cold and silent and waiting. She approached the door and studied it in the light. The metal was thick, industrial grade, designed to withstand force. But the hinges, she noticed, were old. And old metal, no matter how strong, eventually weakened. She set up the grinder, tested it, and began to cut. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, a high-pitched scream that made her ears ring. Sparks flew in brilliant arcs, illuminating the corridor in flashes of white light. She worked steadily, cutting through the first hinge, then the second, then the third. It took over an hour, and by the time she finished, her arms ached, and her shirt was soaked with sweat. But the hinges were cut. She set the grinder down, picked up the crowbar, and wedged it into the gap between the door and the frame. She pulled. The door shifted, just slightly. She pulled harder, throwing her weight into it, and with a groan of metal, the door swung inward and fell with a crash that echoed through the basement. Sarah stepped back, breathing hard, and shone the flashlight into the room beyond. The vault was smaller than she had imagined, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, the walls lined with metal shelves. But it wasn't empty. The shelves held boxes, dozens of them, stacked neatly, labeled with faded handwriting. Sarah stepped inside, her heart pounding, and opened the first box. Inside were documents, certificates, bonds, old stock certificates from companies she didn't recognize. She set it aside and opened another. More of the same. And another. And another. She didn't understand what she was looking at, not yet, but she knew enough to recognize that these weren't just papers. They were financial instruments. Old, maybe worthless, but maybe not. And then she opened a box on the bottom shelf. Inside, wrapped in cloth, were bars of metal. She pulled one out and felt its weight. It was heavy, dense, with a dull yellow sheen. She turned it over in her hands, and in the dim light of the flashlight, she saw the markings stamped into the surface. A serial number, a weight measurement, and a word that made her stop breathing. Gold. Sarah stood in the vault, holding the bar in her hands, and felt the world shift around her. She set it down carefully, as if it might shatter, and opened the other boxes on the shelf. More bars, 7 in total, each one stamped with the same markings. She didn't know exactly how much they were worth, but she knew gold was valuable. Very valuable. She pulled out her phone, her hands shaking, and searched for the current price of gold. The numbers that came up made her dizzy. If each bar was what it appeared to be, if they were real, if they hadn't been reported or claimed, then she was holding more money in her hands than she had earned in her entire life. She sat down on the floor of the vault, the flashlight resting beside her, and tried to process what she had found. This wasn't just a lucky break. This wasn't just a small windfall that would get her through a few months. This was life-changing. This was everything she had ever needed and more. She thought about the eviction notice, about the diner, about the mockery and the disbelief, about the people who had told her she was making a mistake. And she thought about Emma, waiting for her at her mother's house, trusting her, believing in her. She had been right. Against all odds, against all reason, she had been right. The warehouse wasn't worthless. It was a treasure. Sarah didn't move for a long time. She sat on the cold, concrete floor of the vault, the gold bar beside her, and tried to make her mind accept what her eyes were seeing. The flashlight beam illuminated the boxes stacked on the shelves, each one potentially holding more than she could comprehend. Her hands were still trembling, not from fear now, but from something else entirely. A kind of electric shock that ran through her body and refused to settle. She picked up the gold bar again, felt its weight, ran her fingers over the stamped markings. It looked real. It felt real. But she had learned long ago that things were not always what they seemed, and hope could be the cruelest trick of all. She forced herself to stand, to think practically. She needed to know more. She needed to know if what she had found was genuine, if it was legal, if it was hers to keep. She took photos of everything: the vault, the shelves, and the boxes, the gold bars from every angle. She photographed the serial numbers, the weight stamps, the certificates, and bonds she didn't yet understand. Every piece of evidence carefully documented. Then she carefully wrapped one of the smaller bars in cloth, placed it in her bag, and zipped it closed. She would need to have it tested, appraised, verified. She couldn't trust her own judgment, not with something this important. Before leaving the vault, she opened a few more boxes, unable to resist. One contained old stock certificates, hundreds of them, bound with rubber bands that crumbled when she touched them. The companies listed were names she didn't recognize, but the certificates themselves were ornate, printed on thick paper with elaborate borders and seals. Another box held bonds, government savings bonds from the 1980s, their denominations ranging from $50 to $10,000. She didn't know if they were still valid, if they could be redeemed, but she carefully placed them back and made a note to research it later. A third box contained jewelry, not costume jewelry, but pieces that gleamed even in the dim flashlight beam. Necklaces, rings, watches, bracelets. Some were in small velvet boxes, others loose, all of them covered in a fine layer of dust. Sarah closed the boxes and stepped back, overwhelmed. This wasn't just a vault. It was a time capsule, a hidden archive of wealth that someone had sealed away and never returned for. She thought about the bankruptcy documents she had found upstairs, the company that had owned this building, the people who had worked here. Had they known about this? Had they hidden it intentionally, planning to return? Or had it been forgotten, lost in the chaos of a business collapsing, buried beneath paperwork, and years until it became just another secret swallowed by time? She climbed the stairs slowly, her mind racing. When she emerged into the warehouse, the afternoon light was different, softer, tinged with gold. Everything looked the same, but she felt as though she had stepped into a different world. The building was still a ruin, still a disaster, but now it held something that changed everything. She walked to the car, placed the bag carefully in the trunk, and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. She pulled out her phone and stared at it, trying to decide who to call first. Not Linda. Not her mother. Not anyone who had laughed or doubted. She needed someone who could help her understand what she had found without telling the world before she was ready. She searched for gold buyers near the city. Several results came up, but most of them looked like pawn shops or jewelry stores. She needed someone more professional, more discreet. She refined her search and found a name that appeared on several forums and reviews. Marcus Chen, an independent appraiser and precious metals dealer who worked by appointment only. His website was simple, professional, with testimonials from people who had sold estates, coins, and investment gold. Sarah called the number. A man answered on the third ring, his voice calm and measured. She explained, carefully, that she had something she needed appraised. Gold bars. He asked a few questions. How many? Where had she acquired them? Were they stamped? Sarah answered as honestly as she dared without revealing too much. He told her he could see her the next day if she brought one of the bars to his office. She agreed and hung up, her heart still pounding. That night, she barely slept. She picked Emma up from her mother's house, endured the questions about where she had been all day, and deflected with vague answers about cleaning the warehouse and figuring out her next steps. Her mother's disapproval was palpable, but Sarah didn't care. Not anymore. When she finally lay down in the small apartment, Emma curled beside her. She stared at the ceiling and thought about the gold bar hidden in her closet, wrapped in towels. She thought about the vault, the boxes, the possibilities. She thought about what would happen if it was real, if it was worth what she hoped. And she thought about what would happen if it wasn't, if somehow she had been wrong, if this was just another door closing in her face. The next morning, she dropped Emma off at preschool. The first time in weeks, she hadn't asked her mother for help. Then she drove downtown to the address Marcus Chen had given her. The office was located in a nondescript building, the kind that housed accountants and insurance agents. She took the elevator to the third floor and found the door marked with his name in simple lettering. She knocked. A voice told her to come in. She entered. The office was small but meticulously organized. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books, binders, and display cases containing coins and bars of various metals. A large desk sat in the center, covered with tools she didn't recognize. Magnifying lamps, scales, and testing equipment. Behind the desk sat a man in his 50s, Asian, with graying hair and glasses perched on his nose. He looked up when she entered and gestured to the chair across from him. Sarah sat, the bag on her lap, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then he smiled, a small, professional smile, and asked to see what she had brought. Sarah unzipped the bag and carefully placed the gold bar on the desk. Marcus leaned forward, his expression unchanging, and picked it up. He examined it closely, turning it over in his hands, studying the markings. Then he set it on a scale and noted the weight. He picked up a small handheld device, something that looked like a scanner, and ran it over the surface of the bar. He made notes on a pad of paper. Then he looked up at her and asked where she had gotten it. Sarah hesitated. She told him the truth, or part of it, that she had bought an old warehouse at auction and found a locked vault in the basement. That inside were several bars like this one and other items she didn't yet understand. She asked if it was real. Marcus set the bar down and removed his glasses, cleaning them with a cloth from his desk. Then he put them back on and looked at her with an expression that was hard to read. "It's real," he said. "This is a 1 kilogram gold bar, .9999 fine, which means it's essentially pure gold. The markings indicate it was produced by a refinery that operated in the 1980s and early 90s. It's genuine. Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. She asked how much it was worth. Marcus glanced at his computer screen, checking the current market price for gold. Based on today's rate, he said, approximately $65,000. Sarah stared at him. She asked him to repeat that. He did, patiently. $65,000, give or take a few hundred depending on the buyer. Sarah's hands gripped the arms of the chair. She thought about the 7 bars she had seen in the vault. 7 times 65,000. That was over $400,000, just in gold, not counting the bonds, the stock certificates, the jewelry, the other boxes she hadn't even opened yet. She felt dizzy, unmoored, as if gravity had stopped working. Marcus watched her carefully, then asked how many more bars she had. She told him there were 6 others, possibly more. He nodded slowly and said that if she wanted to sell them, he could help facilitate that, but he recommended she have everything appraised properly first. Not just the gold, but the other items she mentioned. Stock certificates could be worthless, or they could be valuable, depending on the companies and whether they were still active or had been bought out. Bonds could be redeemed, but it depended on their type and maturity date. Jewelry needed to be assessed by a gemologist. He gave her a list of people to contact: an estate appraiser, a financial analyst who specialized in old securities, a jeweler he trusted. He told her to be careful, to document everything, and to consult a lawyer before selling or liquidating anything. There were laws about found property, about abandoned assets, about estates and liens. She needed to make sure she was legally entitled to what she had found. Sarah thanked him, her voice barely above a whisper, and asked if she could leave the bar with him to sell. He said he could, but advised her to think about it first, to make sure she understood what she was doing. She nodded, took the bar back, and left the office in a daze. She sat in her car for 20 minutes, staring at the steering wheel. $65,000 for 1 bar. She had 7, possibly more, plus everything else. She couldn't comprehend it. She tried to imagine what that kind of money would mean. No more eviction notices. No more choosing between groceries and electricity. No more exhaustion. No more fear. No more nights lying awake wondering how she would survive the next month. She could pay off her debts. She could move Emma to a better place. She could give her daughter the life she deserved. The life Sarah had always dreamed of giving her, but never thought possible. But first, she needed to make sure it was legal. And she needed to make sure no one could take it away. She drove to the public library and spent the next 3 hours researching. She read about found property laws, about abandoned assets, about what happened when someone discovered valuables on property they owned. The answers were complicated, varying by state and situation. In general, if the property was legally hers, and if the previous owners had abandoned it without claim, then what she found could be considered hers as well. But there were exceptions. If the items were stolen, if there were outstanding liens or debts, if someone came forward with proof of ownership, the situation could change. She needed a lawyer. She found one through an online directory, a woman who specialized in property law and estate disputes. Sarah called and explained her situation in broad terms. The lawyer, whose name was Jennifer Park, listened without interrupting. When Sarah finished, Jennifer was quiet for a moment, then said they should meet in person. She had an opening the next afternoon. Sarah agreed and hung up, feeling both relieved and terrified. This was real. This was happening. And she had no idea if she was about to gain everything or lose it all over again. That evening, she went back to the warehouse. She couldn't stay away. She needed to see the vault again, to make sure it was still there, that she hadn't imagined it. She brought a better flashlight this time, and a portable lantern she had bought with the last of her cash. She descended into the basement and stood in the vault, the light filling the small room. She opened more boxes, carefully inventorying what she found. More stock certificates, more bonds, more jewelry. In one box, tucked at the very bottom, she found cash. Old bills, mostly hundreds and fifties, bundled with paper bands. She counted them, her hands shaking. $30,000. Just sitting there, forgotten. She sat on the floor and tried to process it all. Someone had hidden this. Someone had sealed it away, intending to come back for it, and never did. She thought about the company that had gone bankrupt, about the chaos and desperation that must have followed. Had the owner stashed this here, hoping to retrieve it later? Had employees hidden it, planning to split it after the dust settled? Or had it been forgotten entirely, buried in paperwork, lost in the collapse? She would probably never know. But what she did know was that she had found it. And now it was hers. If she could prove it, if she could keep it. She worked late into the evening, moving carefully through the vault, photographing everything, taking notes. She found a box filled with old coins, silver dollars, and commemorative pieces that looked like they might have numismatic value. She found another box containing watches, expensive brands she recognized from advertisements. Rolex, Omega, Patek Philippe. Some of them still ticked when she held them to her ear. In the very back of the vault, behind everything else, she found a metal case, locked with a combination lock. She tried prying it open with the crowbar, but the case was too sturdy. She made a note to bring bolt cutters the next day. When she finally left the warehouse, it was past midnight. She drove home slowly, exhausted but unable to rest. Her mind wouldn't stop racing. She thought about the meeting with the lawyer, about what she would say, about what questions would be asked. She thought about the appraisers, the dealers, the logistics of turning what she had found into actual, usable money. She thought about Emma, about the future that was suddenly within reach. And she thought about the people who had mocked her. Linda at the diner, her landlord, her mother. She thought about their faces when they learned the truth, not because she wanted to gloat, but because she wanted them to understand that sometimes, when you have nothing left to lose, the craziest decision can be the one that saves you. The next afternoon, Sarah sat across from Jennifer Park in a small office that smelled of coffee and old books. Jennifer was younger than Sarah had expected, maybe early 30s, with sharp eyes and a direct manner. Sarah told her everything. The auction, the warehouse, the vault, the gold, the bonds, the jewelry, the cash. Everything. Jennifer took notes, asked clarifying questions, and when Sarah finished, she sat back in her chair and considered. Then she explained what Sarah needed to do. First, document everything. Photos, lists, descriptions. Second, research the property history. Find out who owned the building before it went to auction, whether there were any claims or liens, whether anyone had reported the missing assets. Third, consult with appraisers to determine the full value. Fourth, and most importantly, file a claim with the county to establish legal ownership of the found property. Jennifer explained that because Sarah had purchased the property legally at a public auction, and because the vault and its contents were on that property, she had a strong claim to ownership. But the process wasn't automatic. She needed to follow the legal steps, notify the appropriate authorities, and allow time for any potential claimants to come forward. If no one did, the property would be legally hers. It would take time, maybe months, but if she did it correctly, she would be protected. Sarah asked what would happen if someone did come forward. Jennifer said it depended on their claim. If they had documentation proving ownership, things could get complicated. But if the assets had been abandoned for decades, If the previous owners were defunct or deceased, if no one had reported the loss, the likelihood of a successful challenge was low. Sarah left the office feeling both hopeful and overwhelmed. She had a plan now, a path forward, but the road was longer and more complicated than she had hoped. She spent the next several days following Jennifer's advice. She hired the estate appraiser Marcus had recommended, a man named Robert Fielding, who came to the warehouse with a team and spent an entire day cataloging the vault's contents. He photographed everything, tested the gold bars with professional equipment, examined the jewelry through a loupe, and sorted through the bonds and certificates with meticulous care. When he finished, he told Sarah he would need a week to compile a full report, but he could give her a preliminary estimate. The gold alone was worth approximately $450,000. The jewelry, pending gemological assessment, was likely worth another $100,000 to $200,000. The bonds, if redeemable, could be worth anywhere from $50,000 to several million, depending on maturity and compounding interest. The stock certificates were harder to assess, but some of the companies had been acquired by larger corporations, which meant the shares might still have value. In total, he estimated, she could be looking at anywhere from $1 to $5 million, possibly more. Sarah stood in the warehouse, surrounded by the ruins she had bought for $300, and felt tears stream down her face. She wasn't sure if they were tears of relief, joy, disbelief, or all three. Robert placed a hand on her shoulder and told her she had made an extraordinary discovery, that she should be proud, that not many people would have taken the risk she did or put in the work to uncover what had been hidden. She thanked him, her voice breaking, and he left her alone in the building. She sat on the floor, surrounded by the rubble and dust, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope. Not the fragile, desperate hope that crumbled at the first sign of resistance, but something stronger, something solid, something real. The financial analyst Jennifer had recommended was a woman named Patricia Lim, who worked for a firm specializing in historical securities. Sarah met with her a few days later, bringing copies of the stock certificates and bonds. Patricia examined them with the practiced eye of someone who had seen thousands of similar documents. She explained that many of the companies listed on the certificates no longer existed, but several had been acquired or merged with larger entities. Those shares, if properly documented and claimed, could be converted to shares in the acquiring companies. The process would take time, and there would be fees, but the potential value was significant. The bonds were easier. Most of them were government savings bonds, which could be redeemed through the Treasury Department. Some had matured decades ago and had been accruing interest ever since. Patricia estimated that the bonds alone could be worth close to $200,000. Sarah left the meeting with a stack of paperwork and instructions on how to file claims with various financial institutions. It was tedious, bureaucratic work, but she didn't mind. For the first time in her life, she was dealing with paperwork that led to something other than debt and disappointment. She spent her evenings, after putting Emma to bed, filling out forms, making phone calls, sending emails. She hired Jennifer to handle the legal filings and guide her through the process of establishing ownership. She contacted the county clerk's office and filed the required notices. She published a legal announcement in the local newspaper, as required by law, stating that found property had been discovered and inviting any claimants to come forward within 60 days. Then she waited. The waiting was harder than the work. Every day felt like it stretched longer than the last. She kept working at the diner, even though she wanted to quit, because she needed the income until everything was finalized. She kept living in the small apartment, even though she had been officially evicted and was staying only because the landlord hadn't yet enforced the order. She kept the discovery secret, telling only Linda and her mother, and even then, and only in the vaguest terms. She had found something valuable in the warehouse, She was working with lawyers and appraisers. She would know more soon. Linda asked if it was drugs. Sarah laughed and said no. Her mother asked if it was legal. Sarah said it would be, once the process was complete. Neither of them fully believed her. She could see it in their faces, the skepticism, the doubt. They thought she was exaggerating, or delusional, or both. She didn't try to convince them. She just waited. 4 weeks into the 60-day waiting period, Sarah received a call from Jennifer. Someone had come forward, a lawyer representing the estate of the company that had once owned the warehouse. They claimed that the assets in the vault belonged to the estate and should be turned over immediately. Sarah felt her stomach drop. This was what she had feared, that someone would appear, that she would lose everything just as it was within reach. But Jennifer told her not to panic. The claim would need to be substantiated. They would need to prove ownership, show documentation, demonstrate that the assets had not been abandoned. And based on what Jennifer had already uncovered in her research, the company had declared bankruptcy in 1991, and its assets had been liquidated or dissolved. The vault had not been listed in any inventory. There were no records of the gold, the bonds, or the jewelry. It appeared that whoever had hidden the vault's contents had done so off the books, possibly to avoid creditors, which meant the estate's claim was weak. Jennifer filed a response, arguing that the assets had been abandoned, and that they hadn't been disclosed during the bankruptcy proceedings, and that Sarah, as the legal owner of the property, had a superior claim. The case would likely go to mediation, possibly to court, but Jennifer was confident they would prevail. Sarah hung up the phone and sat in silence for a long time. She felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her again, but this time, it was different. She wasn't helpless. She had a lawyer. She had documentation. She had followed the rules. She had done everything right. And she wasn't going to let anyone take this away from her. Not after everything she had been through. Not after everything she had risked. The mediation was scheduled for 6 weeks later. In the meantime, life continued. Sarah kept working, kept dropping Emma off at preschool, kept living in the small apartment that no longer felt like home. But something had changed. People at the diner had started to notice. Linda, who couldn't keep a secret to save her life, had mentioned to a few of the other waitresses that Sarah had found something valuable in the warehouse. Word spread. The other waitresses asked questions. The cook wanted to know if it was treasure. The manager pulled her aside and asked if she needed time off to deal with legal matters. Sarah deflected as best she could, but the attention made her uncomfortable. She wasn't ready for people to know. Not yet. Not until it was final. Her mother, skeptical at first, started asking more questions. When Sarah mentioned the mediation, her mother's tone shifted. She asked if Sarah had really found something valuable. Sarah said yes. Her mother asked how much. Sarah hesitated, then told her. Possibly millions. Her mother was silent for a long time. Then she said she hoped Sarah would be smart about it, that she wouldn't waste it, that she would think about Emma's future. Sarah said she would, and hung up. She knew her mother meant well, but the word stung. As if Sarah hadn't been thinking about Emma's future every single day for the past 4 years. As if every decision she had made, every sacrifice, hadn't been for her daughter. The 60-day notice period ended. No other claimants came forward. Jennifer filed a motion to dismiss the estate's claim, and the court scheduled a hearing. Sarah attended, sitting in the back of the courtroom, watching as Jennifer argued her case with precision and confidence. The estate's lawyer presented their argument, but it was clear they had little to stand on. They had no records of the vault, no proof that the assets belonged to the company, no explanation for why they had never been reported or disclosed. The judge listened, asked a few questions, and then ruled. The assets, he said, appeared to have been abandoned. the estate had failed to demonstrate a superior claim. Therefore, the property rightfully belonged to Sarah, the current legal owner of the warehouse. The gavel came down, and Sarah felt her heart leap. It was over. She had won. Jennifer turned and smiled at her, a small, professional smile that carried the weight of victory. They left the courtroom together, and Jennifer explained what would happen next. Sarah could now move forward with selling or liquidating the assets. She could access the accounts, redeem the bonds, and sell the gold and jewelry. It would take time, but the process was straightforward now. Sarah thanked her, her voice thick with emotion, and walked out into the bright afternoon. She stood on the courthouse steps, looked up at the sky, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Freedom. Not just financial freedom, though that was part of it, but freedom from the constant fear, the constant pressure, the constant sense that she was one step away from disaster. She had done it. Against all odds, against all the mockery and doubt and disbelief, she had done it. The warehouse, the ruin everyone said was worthless, had saved her life. The process of converting her discovery into actual, usable money took longer than Sarah had anticipated. But every step felt like a small miracle. Marcus Chen helped her sell the gold bars through a network of private buyers and institutional dealers. He advised her to sell them gradually rather than all at once, to avoid depressing the market price and to maintain discretion. The first bar sold within a week, and when the wire transfer hit her bank account, Sarah stared at the screen for 10 minutes, unable to believe the numbers were real. $67,420. More money than she had earned in 2 years of working at the diner. And there were 6 more bars waiting. She paid her rent first. Not just the 3 months she owed, but 6 months in advance. When she handed the check to her landlord, his expression shifted from surprise to something that might have been respect, or perhaps just confusion. He asked where she had gotten the money. When Sarah told him she had sold something valuable from the warehouse, he studied her face, trying to determine if she was lying, then folded the check and told her the eviction was canceled. She could stay as long as she wanted. Sarah thanked him, turned, and walked away. She didn't tell him she had no intention of staying. She was done with that apartment, done with that building, done with that life. The bonds were redeemed through the Treasury Department, a process that required forms, identification, and patience. Patricia Lim handled most of the paperwork, guiding Sarah through the bureaucratic maze. Some of the bonds had matured decades ago and had been accruing compound interest ever since. When the final total was calculated, Sarah received a check for $212,000. She deposited it and watched the balance in her account climb to a number she had never imagined seeing, and felt tears sting her eyes. This was real. This was happening. She wasn't dreaming. The jewelry required a gemologist, a woman named Dr. Helena Strauss, who examined each piece under magnification, testing stones, verifying authenticity, appraising value. Several of the pieces were exceptional. A diamond necklace appraised at $75,000, a vintage Rolex in pristine condition worth $40,000, a pair of emerald earrings that Dr. Strauss said belonged in a museum, worth at least $60,000. In total, the jewelry collection was valued at just over $300,000. Sarah sold most of it through a private dealer Marcus recommended, keeping only a simple gold bracelet for herself, and something to remember what she had found and what it had meant. The stock certificates were more complicated. Patricia worked with brokers and legal experts to trace the lineage of each company, determining which had been acquired, which had dissolved, which had shares that could still be claimed. The process took months, but eventually, several of the certificates were converted into shares of modern corporations. The total value came to $190,000, less than Sarah had hoped, but far more than she had ever expected to have. When the final transfer was complete, when all the accounts had been settled and all the checks had cleared, Sarah sat down with Jennifer and reviewed the numbers. After legal fees, appraisal costs, and taxes, her net total was just over $2,800,000. $2.8 million. More money than she had ever conceived of possessing. More money than would change everything. The first thing she did was pay off every debt she had. Medical bills from Emma's birth that she had been paying $5 at a time. Credit card balances that had ballooned with interest. The small personal loans she had taken from friends and never been able to fully repay. She wrote checks, transferred money, watched the balances drop to zero. It felt like lifting weights off her chest, one by one, until she could finally breathe freely. Then she went to the diner. She found the manager in his office, a cramped room that smelled of cigarettes and old paperwork, and told him she was quitting. He looked up, surprised, and asked if she had found another job. Sarah said she didn't need another job. She thanked him for the work, shook his hand, and walked out. She didn't tell him why. She didn't owe him an explanation. Linda cornered her in the parking lot before she could leave. "Sarah, what's going on?" Linda asked, her voice tinged with concern and curiosity. "You've been acting strange for weeks." Sarah smiled, a real smile, and told her the truth. That she had found something in the warehouse, that it had been appraised, authenticated, and legally cleared, that she was now financially secure. Linda stared at her, mouth open, then laughed in disbelief. "You're serious?" she said. Sarah nodded. Linda asked how much. Sarah hesitated, then said, "Enough. More than enough." Linda hugged her, hard, and when she pulled back, her eyes were wet. "I can't believe you did it," Linda said. "I thought you were crazy." Sarah laughed and said, "So did I." So the other waitresses gathered around, and Linda, unable to contain herself, announced that Sarah had struck it rich. The reactions varied. Some were genuinely happy, congratulating her, asking questions. Others were skeptical, their smiles tight, their eyes narrow. One woman, a waitress named Diane, who had always been cold to Sarah, said it didn't seem fair. That some people worked their whole lives and never got lucky. Sarah looked at her and said quietly, "It wasn't luck. It was a risk. And it could have been nothing." Diane didn't respond, but her expression said everything. The resentment, the jealousy, the disbelief that someone like Sarah, someone at the bottom, could rise so far so fast. Sarah didn't let it bother her. She had learned long ago that not everyone would be happy for her success, and that was their burden to carry. Not hers. Her mother's reaction was more complicated. Sarah invited her to lunch at a restaurant she could never have afforded before, a quiet place with white tablecloths and waiters who refilled water glasses without being asked. She told her mother everything: the vault, the gold, the legal battle, the final totals. Her mother listened in silence, her expression unreadable. When Sarah finished, her mother set down her fork and said, "I didn't think you could do it. I thought you were throwing your life away." Sarah nodded. "I know," she said. Her mother looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in years, Sarah saw something other than disappointment in her eyes. "I'm proud of you," her mother said, her voice cracking. "I'm sorry I doubted you." Sarah reached across the table and took her mother's hand. "It's okay," she said. I doubted myself too." The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it happened steadily, piece by piece. Sarah found a house in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, a 3-bedroom home with a yard where Emma could play. It wasn't a mansion, wasn't ostentatious, but it was safe, clean, and entirely theirs. No landlord, no eviction notices, just a place to call home. She furnished it slowly, carefully, choosing each piece with intention. A bed for Emma with a canopy the girl had always dreamed of. A kitchen table where they could eat dinner together without the television blaring through thin walls. A living room with soft couches and windows that let in light. When they moved in, Emma ran from room to room, laughing, her voice echoing in the empty spaces. "Is this really ours, Mama?" she asked. Sarah knelt down, pulled her daughter into a hug and said, "Yes, this is really ours." She enrolled Emma in a better preschool, one with art classes and a playground, and teachers who smiled when they greeted the children. She bought her daughter new clothes, not from thrift stores, but from regular stores, the kind other parents shopped at. She signed her up for the dance class Emma had always wanted, and the first time Sarah watched her daughter twirl across the studio floor in a pink leotard, she cried. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of knowing her daughter would never have to feel the sting of being the kid who couldn't afford things. Emma would have opportunities. She would have choices. She would have a future that wasn't defined by scarcity and fear. Sarah set aside money for Emma's education, opening accounts that would grow over time, ensuring that when her daughter was ready for college, the money would be there. She set aside money for emergencies, for medical expenses, for the unpredictable curveballs life always seemed to throw. And she kept enough accessible to live comfortably, not extravagantly, but without the constant anxiety that had defined her adult life. She didn't buy a new car, didn't take expensive vacations, didn't indulge in luxury for its own sake. She lived modestly, gratefully, with the knowledge that she had been given a second chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. The warehouse itself became something different in her mind. She didn't sell it right away. Instead, she had it cleaned, the debris removed, the roof repaired. She didn't know what she would do with it yet, but she wanted to preserve it, and to honor the place that had saved her. People from the neighborhood began to notice the work being done. They asked questions. Who owned the building? What was going to happen to it? Sarah deflected most of the inquiries, but word spread. The single mom who had bought the wreck for pennies. The woman everyone said was crazy. She had found something inside, something valuable. Rumors grew, inflated, distorted. Some said she had found gold. Others said it was artwork. One person claimed she had discovered a hidden drug stash worth millions. Sarah ignored them all. She had learned that people would believe what they wanted to believe, and the truth, when it was extraordinary, was often harder to accept than fiction. One afternoon, Sarah returned to the warehouse alone. She stood in the center of the vast, empty space, now clean and quiet, and thought about the journey that had brought her here. The desperation, the mockery, the fear. The moment she had raised her hand at the auction, not knowing if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. The hours spent digging through rubble, searching for something she couldn't name. The discovery of the vault, the gold bars gleaming in the flashlight beam, the legal battles, the waiting, the uncertainty, and finally, the victory. She thought about the life she had lived before and the life she was building now, and she felt a gratitude so deep it almost hurt. She thought about the people who had doubted her, not with anger, but with understanding. They had seen what everyone saw, a struggling single mother making a desperate, foolish choice. They couldn't have known what lay beneath the surface. They couldn't have known that sometimes the most worthless-looking opportunities are the ones that matter most. She forgave them, even the ones who had been cruel, because their doubt had never been personal. It had been a reflection of a world that taught people to play it safe, to avoid risk, to accept their limitations. Sarah had refused to accept hers, and that refusal had made all the difference. Months passed. Emma thrived in her new school, making friends, learning to read, growing into a confident, joyful child. Sarah enrolled in community college classes, something she had always wanted to do, but never had the time or money for. She studied business administration, thinking that maybe, someday, she would do something with the warehouse, turn it into something useful, something that gave back to the community that had witnessed her transformation. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she had time now. Time to think, to plan, to dream, without the constant pressure of survival weighing on every decision. Linda visited often, bringing wine and laughter and stories from the diner. She told Sarah about the new waitress who had taken her place, a young woman who complained about the tips and the hours and the customers. Linda said it made her think about Sarah, about how she had never complained, how she had just kept working, kept pushing, kept trying. "I always admired that about you," Linda said, "even when I thought you were crazy for buying that warehouse. You never gave up." Sarah smiled and said, "I didn't have a choice. Giving up wasn't an option." Linda raised her glass. "Well," she said, "I'm glad you didn't. Because look at you now." Her mother became a regular presence in their lives, visiting on weekends, taking Emma to the park, helping Sarah with errands. The distance that had existed between them began to close, not because of the money, but because of what the money had revealed. Sarah's strength, her determination, her refusal to be defined by her circumstances. Her mother apologized again, more than once, for not believing in her. Sarah told her it was okay, that doubt was natural, that she had doubted herself plenty of times. What mattered was that they were here now, together, building something better. The legal notice Sarah had published in the newspaper, the one inviting claimants to come forward, was eventually picked up by a local reporter who found the story intriguing. She reached out to Sarah, asking for an interview. Sarah hesitated. She wasn't sure she wanted the attention, the scrutiny, the inevitable questions. But Jennifer advised her that controlling the narrative could be useful, that telling her story on her own terms might prevent misinformation and speculation. Sarah agreed to a single interview on the condition that Emma's face not be shown and that certain details remain private. The article ran on a Sunday, accompanied by a photo of Sarah standing in front of the warehouse. The headline read, "Single Mother's $300 Gamble Leads to $1 Million Discovery." The story was fair, accurate, and to Sarah's relief, respectful. It detailed her struggle, her decision to buy the warehouse, the discovery of the vault, the legal battle, and her eventual success. It quoted Jennifer, who called Sarah's case a textbook example of perseverance and due diligence. It quoted Marcus Chen, who said the discovery was one of the most remarkable he had seen in his career. And it ended with a quote from Sarah herself. "I didn't buy the warehouse because I thought I'd get rich. I bought it because I was out of options and I needed to try something. I got lucky, yes, but I also worked for it. I didn't give up when everyone said I should, and I think that matters." The response was overwhelming. The article was shared online, picked up by regional outlets, then national ones. Sarah's phone rang constantly. Reporters wanted interviews. Producers wanted her story for television. Strangers sent messages of congratulations, of inspiration, of requests for money. Sarah ignored most of it. She gave a few more interviews, more carefully selected, and then withdrew. She had never wanted fame. She had only wanted security, stability, a future for her daughter. And now she had it. The rest was noise. But the attention did bring some unexpected connections. A woman reached out, someone who had worked for the company that once owned the warehouse. She was elderly now, in her 80s, but her memory was sharp. She told Sarah that the company's owner had been a difficult man, paranoid about creditors and the IRS. When the business started failing, he had hidden assets, stashing gold, cash, and valuables in places no one would think to look. The vault had been his insurance policy, his secret escape plan. But he died suddenly, a heart attack before he could retrieve it. His family hadn't known about it. The bankruptcy lawyers hadn't known. It had been lost, sealed away, waiting for someone to find it. Sarah thanked the woman for the information, and they spoke for over an hour, piecing together the history of the warehouse, the life it had once held. It gave Sarah a sense of closure, a context for the discovery that had changed her life. 1 year after the auction, Sarah stood in the warehouse again, this time with a small crowd. She had decided to turn the building into a community center, a place where people could take classes, hold meetings, access resources. She had worked with architects, contractors, and community organizers to design something that honored the building's history while serving a new purpose. The grand opening was modest, just a ribbon cutting and a few speeches, but it felt significant. Sarah spoke briefly, thanking everyone who had helped, Fontaine dedicating the space to second chances, to the idea that sometimes the things others overlook are the things that matter most. Emma stood beside her, holding her hand, wearing a dress Sarah had bought for the occasion. After the ceremony, people came up to congratulate Sarah, to tour the new space, to ask questions. One man, older, with kind eyes, introduced himself as a teacher from the local high school. He said the center would make a real difference in the community, that kids needed places like this, places that believed in potential rather than judged on circumstances. Sarah thanked him, and as he walked away, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The warehouse had saved her. Now it would help save others. That evening, after the event, Sarah sat on the porch of her house, watching Emma play in the yard. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The air was warm, the neighborhood quiet. Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her here, the eviction notice taped to her door, the auction where no one else had bid, the moment she had lowered herself into the darkness of the basement, the gold bar in her hands, heavy with promise, the legal battles, the doubt, the fear, and the victory, the overwhelming, life-changing victory. She thought about the lessons she had learned. That risk and desperation sometimes looked the same, but they weren't. That what others dismissed could be exactly what you needed. That persistence, even in the face of mockery and doubt, could lead to places you never imagined. And that second chances, when they came, had to be earned, protected, and honored. She had done all of that. And now, sitting on her porch, watching her daughter laugh and play, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Emma ran over, breathless, and climbed onto Sarah's lap. "Mama," she said, "are we rich now?" Sarah smiled and kissed the top of her daughter's head. "We're safe," she said. "And that's better than rich." Emma seemed to consider this, then nodded, satisfied. She leaned back against her mother, and they sat together in the fading light, watching the world settle into evening. Sarah closed her eyes and allowed herself to feel the full weight of gratitude for the warehouse, for the discovery, for the chance to rewrite her story, for the future that stretched out before them, no longer defined by scarcity, but by possibility. Years would pass. Emma would grow, thrive, eventually leave for college on a full scholarship. Though Sarah had set aside more than enough to pay for it, the community center would become a fixture in the neighborhood, a place where lives were changed, where people found hope. Sarah would live quietly, modestly, never forgetting where she had come from or what it had taken to get here. She would speak occasionally at events, sharing her story, encouraging others to take risks when they had nothing left to lose, to look for value in the places others ignored, to believe in the possibility of change even when the odds seemed impossible. And sometimes, late at night, she would drive past the old apartment building where she had once lived, where the eviction notice had hung on her door like a sentence. She would remember the fear, the exhaustion, the desperate choice that had changed everything. And she would feel grateful, not just for the money, though it had transformed her life, but for the reminder that courage, even when it looked like foolishness, could open doors no one else saw. That beneath the surface of what seemed worthless, treasures waited for those willing to dig. And that the best inheritances weren't the ones passed down through generations, but the ones discovered through persistence, hope, and the refusal to accept that your story was already written. Sarah had bought a warehouse for $300. Everyone had laughed. Everyone had doubted. Everyone had been wrong. And now, as she sat on her porch, her daughter beside her, her future secure, she understood the true value of what she had found. It wasn't the gold, or the bonds, or the jewelry. It was the proof that sometimes, when you're at your lowest, when you have nothing left but a crazy idea and the courage to try, that's when miracles happen. Not because you're lucky, but because you're brave enough to bet on yourself when no one else will. The warehouse had held millions in forgotten wealth, but the real fortune was the life it had allowed her to build. A life of dignity, security, and hope. A life where her daughter would never know the fear she had known, where opportunities were abundant rather than scarce, where the future was something to look forward to rather than dread. That was the inheritance she had claimed, not through birthright or luck, but through the simple, radical act of refusing to give up, of seeing possibility where others saw ruin, of taking a risk when risk was all she had left. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Emma pointed at them, counting, her voice soft and sleepy. Sarah held her close, feeling the warmth of her daughter's small body, the steady rhythm of her breathing. And in that moment, surrounded by the life she had fought so hard to create, Sarah felt complete. The journey had been long, painful, uncertain, but it had brought her here. And here, she knew, was exactly where she was meant to be. The warehouse stood across town, its lights glowing in the evening, welcoming people who needed what it offered. Second chances, new beginnings, the belief that transformation was possible. Sarah had given it purpose, but it had given her something far more valuable. It had given her proof that the craziest decisions could be the wisest, that the most worthless-looking opportunities could be the most precious, and that sometimes, when everyone tells you you're wrong, you're exactly right. She had found her fortune not in spite of the doubt, but through it. And that made every moment, every struggle, every tear worth it. The morning Sarah received the final wire transfer, the one that pushed her account balance past the $2 million mark, she did something she hadn't done in years. She went to a coffee shop, the kind with comfortable chairs and books on shelves, the kind she had always walked past because a $5 latte felt like an impossible luxury. She ordered without looking at the price, sat by the window, and simply existed for an hour. No rushing, no calculating, no anxiety about whether she could afford to be there. She watched people pass on the sidewalk, each absorbed in their own struggles and joys, and felt a profound sense of having crossed an invisible threshold. She was no longer the woman running from one crisis to the next. She was someone with space to breathe. A man in a business suit sat at the next table, complaining loudly on his phone about a deal that had fallen through, about money lost, about stress. Sarah listened without meaning to and felt something unexpected. Not superiority, but compassion. She understood now that wealth didn't erase problems, it simply changed them. She had solved the problems that came from not having enough, but she would need to be vigilant about the new ones that came from having too much. the pressure to spend wisely, the fear of losing what she had gained, the subtle shift in how people treated her once they knew. She had already noticed it, the way conversations changed when someone learned about her discovery. Some people grew warmer, more interested. Others grew distant, resentful. She was learning to navigate both. Emma's 4th birthday party was the first one Sarah threw without worrying about cost. She rented a space at a local community center, hired an entertainer, ordered a cake from a real bakery instead of making one from a box mix. She invited Emma's entire preschool class, and when the children arrived, their laughter filling the room, Sarah stood in the corner and watched with tears in her eyes. This was what normal looked like. This was what other parents did without thinking twice. And now, finally, she could give it to her daughter. Emma wore a princess dress she had picked out herself, her face glowing with joy. And when she blew out the candles, Sarah made a silent wish. Not for more money, not for more luck, just for the strength to be worthy of this second chance. One of the mothers approached her after the party, a woman named Teresa, whose daughter was Emma's best friend. Teresa had always been kind to Sarah, never judgmental about the second-hand clothes or the fact that Sarah couldn't afford to contribute much to class parties. Now Teresa smiled and said, "Emma seems so happy lately. Whatever you're doing, it's working." Sarah thanked her, and Teresa added, "I heard you came into some money. Good for you. You deserve it." The words were genuine, without jealousy or agenda, and Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest. Not everyone resented success. Some people, the good ones, simply celebrated it. But not everyone was like Teresa. At the grocery store a few days later, Sarah ran into Diane, the waitress from the diner who had made the comment about fairness. Diane looked Sarah up and down, taking in the new clothes, the confident posture, and her lip curled slightly. "Must be nice," Diane said, "not having to work anymore." Sarah kept her voice even. "I still work," she said, "just not at the diner." Diane laughed, a bitter sound. "Right," she said. "Managing your millions must be exhausting." Sarah didn't take the bait. She simply said, "I hope you have a good day, Diane," and walked away. She had learned that some people needed someone to resent, and nothing she said would change that. Their bitterness was their own burden, not hers. The classes Sarah enrolled in at community college were harder than she expected. She had been out of school for years, and sitting in a classroom with students half her age felt strange at first. But she discovered something surprising. She was good at this. The business courses made sense to her in ways they might not have before, because now she had real-world context. When the professor talked about asset management, Sarah thought about the gold bars. When they discussed legal structures, she thought about the court battle. When they covered financial planning, she thought about the accounts she had opened for Emma's future. She participated in class, asked questions, stayed late to talk with instructors. And slowly, she began to see herself differently. Not just as a mother, not just as a survivor, but as someone capable of building something larger. One of her classmates, a young man named David, asked her once why she was taking classes if she didn't need a job. Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. "Because," she said, "I don't want my life to be defined by a lucky break. I want to build something sustainable. Something I earned through knowledge and effort, not just something I found." David nodded, impressed, and after that, he treated her with a respect that had nothing to do with her money. He saw her as a peer, someone serious about learning, and that mattered to Sarah more than she expected. The warehouse renovation took nearly 8 months. Sarah visited the site weekly, watching as contractors transformed the space. They reinforced the structure, replaced the collapsed roof, installed new windows and doors. They built classrooms along one wall, a computer lab in another section, not a community kitchen in what had once been the old office space. Sarah worked with a local nonprofit to determine what services the neighborhood needed most: after-school programs for kids, job training workshops, English classes for immigrants, a food pantry. The center would offer all of it, funded by an endowment Sarah established, ensuring it would continue long after she was gone. During one visit, she met a woman named Maria, who would eventually become the center's director. Maria had worked in community organizing for 20 years, and when Sarah interviewed her, she was immediately struck by Maria's passion and competence. Maria asked Sarah why she was doing this, why she was investing so much in a neighborhood that wasn't particularly wealthy or influential. Sarah told her the truth. "Because I know what it's like to have nothing," she said, "to feel like the world has forgotten you. This building saved my life. Now, I want it to save others." Maria's eyes grew bright, and she reached across the table to shake Sarah's hand. "I'll make you proud," she said. And she did. Sarah began receiving letters after the news story ran, hundreds of them, forwarded by the newspaper, sent to the community center, delivered to her new address through means she couldn't quite determine. Some were requests for money, barely disguised as congratulations. Others were genuine messages of inspiration from people who said her story had given them hope, had encouraged them to take risks they had been afraid to take. One letter came from a woman in another state who had also bought an abandoned property at auction after reading Sarah's story. She found nothing of value inside, the woman wrote, but she renovated it herself and now ran a small business from the space. "Your courage gave me courage," the letter said. "Thank you." Sarah kept that letter in a drawer by her bed, reading it on days when doubt crept in, when she wondered if she had done enough, been enough, chosen correctly. Emma started asking questions about their old life. "Do you remember when we lived in the little apartment?" she asked one evening as Sarah tucked her into bed. Sarah said yes, she remembered. Emma was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Were we poor?" Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, choosing her words carefully. "We didn't have a lot of money," she said, "but we always had each other, and that made us rich in the ways that mattered most." Emma seemed to consider this, then asked, "Are we rich now?" Sarah smiled. "We're comfortable," she said. "We don't have to worry about money the way we used to. But the most important things haven't changed. I still love you just as much. We're still a family. That's what really matters." Emma nodded, satisfied, and asked one more question. "Mama, were you scared?" Sarah's throat tightened. "Yes," she admitted. "I was very scared. But I did it anyway. And that's what being brave means. Doing the scary thing even when you don't know how it will turn out." The first time someone recognized Sarah in public from the news story, she was at the library with Emma. A woman approached her, hesitant, and asked if she was the person who found the treasure in the warehouse. Sarah confirmed it, bracing for judgment or requests. Instead, the woman smiled warmly and said, "You're an inspiration. My daughter is a single mom, struggling, and I sent her your story. It gave her hope that things could get better." Sarah thanked her, moved by the unexpected kindness, and the woman walked away. Emma tugged at her sleeve. "Mama, are you famous?" Sarah laughed. "No, sweetheart. I'm just someone who got lucky and people heard about it." But Emma looked proud anyway, and Sarah realized that her daughter would grow up with this as part of her story. The knowledge that her mother had taken a risk, faced mockery, persevered, and won. That would shape Emma in ways Sarah couldn't yet fully understand. Sarah's relationship with money evolved slowly. At first, she checked her bank balance obsessively, unable to believe the numbers wouldn't disappear. She kept receipts for everything, tracked every expense, lived as though the windfall might evaporate. But gradually, as months passed and the money remained, She relaxed into a new relationship with financial security. She learned to spend without guilt on things that mattered. Quality food, educational toys for Emma, donations to causes she believed in. But she also learned to say no to impulses, to wait before making large purchases, to think carefully about what truly added value to her life. She never wanted to become someone who took wealth for granted or who lost touch with the struggle she had known. One afternoon, Sarah drove past the old apartment building. She didn't plan to, but the route took her by it, and she slowed, looking up at the third-floor window where she had spent so many sleepless nights. Someone else lived there now, probably facing their own struggles, their own fears. Sarah felt a pang of something not quite sadness, but close, a recognition of how much had changed and how easily it could have gone differently. If she hadn't seen that auction listing, if she hadn't raised her hand, if she hadn't found the vault. Her entire life had hinged on a series of choices and chances, and the weight of that realization was both humbling and empowering. She had agency, but she had also been fortunate. Both could be true at once. Linda threw Sarah a surprise party 6 months after she quit the diner. It was small, just a few people at Linda's house, but it meant everything. The other waitresses who had been kind were there. The cook who always saved Sarah extra fries for Emma. Even the manager who brought a bottle of champagne and toasted to Sarah's success. They sat around Linda's living room, eating potluck food and telling stories. Someone asked Sarah what it felt like to be rich. Sarah thought about it, then said, "It feels like I can finally breathe, like there's space between me and the edge of disaster. That's the best part. Not the money itself, but the distance it creates from constant fear." The room grew quiet, people nodding, understanding in a way that surprised her. Even those who hadn't lived her exact struggle knew what it meant to be one paycheck away from catastrophe. Her success, in some small way, felt like a victory for all of them. Sarah began mentoring other women at the community center, single mothers mostly, who were trying to navigate the impossible math of low wages and high costs. She didn't preach or lecture. She just listened, shared her own story when appropriate, and helped where she could. Sometimes that meant connecting them with resources. Sometimes it meant helping with a job application or a resume. Sometimes it just meant being present, being proof that circumstances could change. One woman, a young mother named Keisha with 2 kids and a third on the way, broke down crying during one of their meetings. "I feel like I'm drowning," Keisha said. "Like no matter how hard I work, I can't get ahead." Sarah handed her tissues and said quietly, "I know. I felt that way too. For years. But you're doing everything right. You're working, you're trying, you're showing up. Sometimes that's all you can do until something shifts. Don't give up." Keisha wiped her eyes and asked, "Did you ever want to give up?" Sarah nodded. "Every single day. But I had a daughter counting on me. And so do you. That's the thing that keeps us going." The locked metal case Sarah had found in the vault, the one she couldn't open at first, was finally opened by a locksmith months after everything else had been appraised. Inside were documents, deeds to other properties, some of which had been sold decades ago, some of which might still exist. Stock certificates from companies Sarah had never heard of. And at the very bottom, a handwritten letter, yellowed with age, addressed to no one. The letter was from the company owner, the man who had hidden everything. It detailed his regrets, his fears, his hope that whoever found this would use it better than he had. "I built an empire on greed," the letter said, "and lost everything that mattered. If you're reading this, you found what I couldn't take with me. Don't make my mistakes. Build something that lasts. Something that helps people." Sarah read the letter 3 times, then filed it carefully with the rest of the documents. She felt as though the man had spoken directly to her across the decades, and she had honored his unintended wish. The warehouse was helping people. She hadn't made his mistakes. Emma's teacher called Sarah in for a conference, and Sarah's stomach dropped, fearing bad news. But the teacher smiled and said Emma was thriving. "She's confident, engaged, and kind to other children," the teacher said. "Whatever changes you've made at home, they're working." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. The teacher continued, "She talks about you a lot, about how you work hard and never give up. She's very proud of her mom." Sarah thanked the teacher, her voice thick, and walked to her car in a daze. She had worried so much about how her struggles had affected Emma, about what the instability and fear had done to her daughter's sense of security. But maybe, just maybe, Emma had also learned resilience, had learned that challenges could be overcome, that her mother would always fight for her, that love was constant even when circumstances weren't. Maybe that was a gift, too, in its own way. One evening, Sarah sat on her porch and called her mother. They talked more now, about small things and large ones, rebuilding a relationship that had frayed under the weight of Sarah's struggles and her mother's worry. During this call, her mother said something unexpected. "I've been thinking about what you did," she said. "Buying that warehouse, taking that risk. And I realized something. I taught you to play it safe, to never take chances, because I was afraid of seeing you fail. But you didn't listen to me, and you succeeded. I'm sorry I didn't believe in you. I should have." Sarah felt her throat tighten. "You were trying to protect me," she said. "I understand that." Her mother's voice was soft. "You protected yourself. And Emma, you're a better mother than I gave you credit for. Maybe better than I was." Sarah didn't know what to say to that, so she just said, "I love you, Mom." Her mother said it back, and they sat in comfortable silence, the phone line connecting them across the miles. The community center's grand opening had been months ago, but Sarah still visited weekly, walking through the halls, watching the programs run. She saw children in the after-school program working on homework, their faces focused. She saw adults in the job training classes learning new skills, building new futures, and she saw families collecting food from the pantry, their dignity intact, because the space was designed with respect, not charity. She saw the computer lab full of people researching, learning, connecting. And she saw Maria, tireless and passionate, making it all work. This, Sarah thought, was what wealth was for. Not hoarding, not luxury for its own sake, but impact, legacy, the chance to change the trajectory of lives the way hers had been changed. Years from now, when Sarah looked back on this time, she would remember not the gold or the money, but the moments that defined her transformation. Emma's laughter in their new home, the letters from strangers who said she had inspired them, the women at the community center finding hope, her mother's apology, Linda's friendship, the teacher's words about Emma thriving, Marcus Chen's respect, so Jennifer Park's competence, Maria's dedication. These were the true treasures, the ones that couldn't be appraised or sold, the ones that made the risk worth taking. She had found wealth in the warehouse, yes, but she had found something more valuable in the journey. She had found herself, her strength, her worth, her purpose. And as she sat on her porch on warm evenings, Emma playing in the yard, the sun setting in brilliant colors, Sarah understood that she wasn't just lucky. She was brave. She had made a choice when choice felt impossible. She had persevered when everyone said to quit. She had believed in possibility when reality offered only despair. And that, more than any amount of money, was what had saved her. Not the warehouse, not the vault, not the gold, but the woman she had been all along. The one who refused to accept that her story was finished when it felt like everything was ending. That woman, strong and stubborn and unbreakable, had always been there. The warehouse had simply given her the chance to prove it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.